This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 15. How Dorothy Happened to Get Lost. It was a beautiful evening, so they drew their camp chairs in a circle before one of the tents, and began to tell stories to amuse themselves and pass away the time before they went to bed. Pretty soon a zebra was seen coming out of the forest, and he trotted straight up to them and said politely, "Good evening, people." The zebra was a sleek little animal and had a slender head, a stubby mane, and a paintbrush tail, very like a donkey's. His neatly shaped white body was covered with regular bars of deep brown, and his hoofs were delicate as those of a deer. "Good evening, friend Zebra," said Omby Amby in reply to the creature's greeting. "Can we do anything for you?" "Yes," answered the zebra. "I should like you to settle a dispute that has long been a bother to me, as to whether there is more water or land in the world." "Who are you disputing with?" asked the Wizard. "With a soft-shell crab," said the zebra. "He lives in a pool where I go to drink every day, and he is a very impertinent crab, I assure you. I have told him many times that the land is much greater in extent than the water, but he will not be convinced. Even this very evening, when I told him he was an insignificant creature who lived in a small pool, he asserted that the water was greater and more important than the land. So, seeing your camp, I decided to ask you to settle the dispute for once and all, that I may not be further annoyed by this ignorant crab." When they had listened to this explanation, Dorothy inquired, "Where is the soft-shell crab?" "Not far away," replied the zebra. "If you will agree to judge between us, I will run and get him." "Run along, then," said the little girl. So the animal pranced into the forest and soon came trotting back to them. When he drew near they found a soft-shell crab clinging fast to the stiff hair of the zebra's head, where it held on by one claw. "Now then, Mr. Crab," said the zebra, "here are the people I told you about, and they know more than you do, who live in a pool, and more than I do, who live in a forest, for they have been travelers all over the world and know every part of it." "There's more of the world than Oz," declared the crab in a stubborn voice. "That is true," said Dorothy, "but I used to live in Kansas in the United States, and I've been to California and to Australia, and so has Uncle Henry." "For my part," added the Shaggy Man, "I've been to Mexico and Boston and many other foreign countries." "And I," said the Wizard, "have been to Europe and Ireland." "So you see," continued the zebra, addressing the crab, "here are people of real consequence, who know what they are talking about." "Then they know there's more water in the world than there is land," asserted the crab in a shrill, petulant voice. "They know you are wrong to make such an absurd statement, and they will probably think you are a lobster instead of a crab," retorted the animal. At this taunt the crab reached out its other claw and seized the zebra's ear, and the creature gave a cry of pain and began prancing up and down, trying to shake off the crab, which clung fast. "Stop pinching!" cried the zebra. "You promised not to pinch if I would carry you here." "And you promised to treat me respectfully," said the crab, letting go the ear. "Well, haven't I?" demanded the zebra. "No, you called me a lobster," said the crab. "Ladies and gentlemen," continued the zebra, "please pardon my poor friend, because he is ignorant and stupid and does not understand. Also, the pinch of his claw is very annoying. So pray tell him that the world contains more land than water, and when he has heard your judgment I will carry him back and dump him into his pool, where I hope he will be more modest in the future." "But we cannot tell him that," said Dorothy gravely, "because it would not be true." "What?" exclaimed the zebra in astonishment. "Do I hear you aright?" "The soft-shell crab is correct," declared the Wizard. "There is considerably more water than there is land in the world." "Impossible!" protested the zebra. "Why, I can run for days upon the land and find but little water." "Did you ever see an ocean?" asked Dorothy. "Never," admitted the zebra. "There is no such thing as an ocean in the Land of Oz." "Well, there are several oceans in the world," said Dorothy. and people sail in ships upon these oceans for weeks and weeks and never see a bit of land at all. And the geographies will tell you that all the oceans put together are bigger than all the land put together." At this the crab began laughing in queer chuckles that reminded Dorothy of the way Billina sometimes cackled. "Now will you give up, Mr. Zebra?" it cried jeeringly. "Now will you give up?" The zebra seemed much humbled. "Of course, I cannot read geographies," he said. "You could take one of the Wizard's school pills," suggested Billina, "and that would make you learned and wise without studying." The crab began laughing again, which so provoked the zebra that he tried to shake the little creature off. This resulted in more ear pinching, and finally Dorothy told them that if they could not behave they must go back to the forest. "I'm sorry I asked you to decide this question," said the zebra crossly. "So long as neither of us could prove we were right, we quite enjoyed the dispute. But now I can never drink at that pool again without the soft shell crab laughing at me. So I must find another drinking place." "Do, do, you ignoramus!" shouted the crab as loudly as his little voice would carry. "Rile some other pool with your clumsy hoofs, and let your betters alone after this." Then the zebra trotted back to the forest, bearing the crab with him, and disappeared amid the gloom of the trees. And as it was now getting dark, the travelers said good night to one another and went to bed. Dorothy awoke just as the light was beginning to get strong next morning, and not caring to sleep any later, she quietly got out of bed, dressed herself, and left the tent where Aunt Em was yet peacefully slumbering. Outside she noticed Billina busily pecking around to secure bugs or other food for breakfast, but none of the men in the other tent seemed awake. So the little girl decided to take a walk in the woods and try to discover some path or road that they might follow when they again started upon their journey. She had reached the edge of the forest when the yellow hen came fluttering along and asked where she was going. "Just to take a walk, Billina, and maybe I'll find some path," said Dorothy. "Then I'll go along," decided Billina, and scarcely had she spoken when Toto ran up and joined them. Toto and the yellow hen had become quite friendly by this time, although at first they did not get along well together. Billina had been rather suspicious of dogs, and Toto had had an idea that it was every dog's duty to chase a hen on sight. But Dorothy had talked to them and scolded them for not being agreeable to one another until they grew better acquainted and became friends. I won't say they loved each other dearly, but at least they had stopped quarreling and now managed to get on together very well. The day was growing lighter every minute and driving the black shadows out of the forest, so Dorothy found it very pleasant walking under the trees. She went some distance in one direction, but not finding a path, presently turned in a different direction. There was no path here either, although she advanced quite a way into the forest, winding here and there among the trees and peering through the bushes in an endeavor to find some beaten track. "I think we'd better go back," suggested the yellow hen after a time. "The people will all be up by this time and breakfast will be ready." "Very well," agreed Dorothy. "Let's see. The camp must be over this way." She had probably made a mistake about that, for after they had gone far enough to have reached the camp, they still found themselves in the thick of the woods. So the little girl stopped short and looked around her, and Toto glanced up into her face with his bright little eyes and wagged his tail as if he knew something was wrong. He couldn't tell much about direction himself, because he had spent his time prowling among the bushes and running here and there, nor had Billina paid much attention to where they were going, being interested in picking bugs from the moss as they passed along. The yellow hen now turned one eye up toward the little girl and asked, "Have you forgotten where the camp is, Dorothy?" "Yes," she admitted. "Have you, Billina?" "I didn't try to remember," returned Billina. "I'd no idea you would get lost, Dorothy." "It's the thing we don't expect, Billina, that usually happens," observed the girl thoughtfully. "But it's no use standing here. Let's go in that direction," pointing a finger at random. "It may be we'll get out of the forest over there." So on they went again, but this way the trees were closer together and the vines were so tangled that often they tripped Dorothy up. Suddenly a voice cried sharply, "Halt!" At first Dorothy could see nothing, although she looked around very carefully, but Billina exclaimed, will I declare." "What is it?" asked the little girl, for Toto began barking at something, and following his gaze she discovered what it was. A row of spoons had surrounded the three, and these spoons stood straight up on their handles and carried swords and muskets. Their faces were outlined in the polished bowls, and they looked very stern and severe. Dorothy laughed at the queer things. "Who are you?" she asked. "We're the Spoon Brigade," said one. "In the service of His Majesty King Kleaver," said another. "And you are our prisoners," said a third. Dorothy sat down on an old stump and looked at them, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "What would happen," she inquired, "if I should set my dog on your brigade?" "He would die," replied one of the spoons sharply. "One shot from our deadly muskets would kill him, big as he is." "Don't risk it, Dorothy," advised the Yellow Hen. "Remember, this is a fairy country, yet none of us three happens to be a fairy." Dorothy grew sober at this. "Perhaps you're right, Billina," she answered. "But how funny it is to be captured by a lot of spoons!" "I do not see anything very funny about it," declared a spoon. "We're the regular military brigade of the kingdom." "What kingdom?" she asked. "Utensia," said he. "I never heard of it before," asserted Dorothy. Then she added thoughtfully: "I don't believe Ozma ever heard of Utensia, either. Tell me, are you not subjects of Ozma of Oz?" "We never have heard of her," retorted a spoon. "We are subjects of King Kleaver and obey only his orders, which are to bring all prisoners to him as soon as they are captured. So step lively, my girl, and march with us, or we may be tempted to cut off a few of your toes with our swords." This threat made Dorothy laugh again. She did not believe she was in any danger, but here was a new and interesting adventure, so she was willing to be taken to Utensia, that she might see what King Kleaver's kingdom was like. End of Chapter 15. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16. How Dorothy Visited Utensia. There must have been from 6 to 8 dozen spoons in the brigade, and they marched away in the shape of a hollow square, with Dorothy, Billina, and Toto in the center of the square. Before they had gone very far, Toto knocked over one of the spoons by wagging his tail, and then the captain of the spoons told the little dog to be more careful, or he would be punished. So Toto was careful, and the Spoon Brigade moved along with astonishing swiftness, while Dorothy really had to walk fast to keep up with it. By and by they left the woods and entered a big clearing, which was the kingdom of Utensia. Standing all around the clearing were a good many cook stoves, ranges, and grills of all sizes and shapes, and besides these there were several kitchen cabinets and cupboards and a few kitchen tables. These things were crowded with utensils of all sorts: frying pans, saucepans, kettles, forks, knives, basting and soup spoons, nutmeg graters, sifters, colanders, meat saws, flat irons, rolling pins, and many other things of a like nature. When the Spoon Brigade appeared with the prisoners, a wild shout arose, and many of the utensils hopped off their stoves or their benches and ran crowding around Dorothy and the hen and the dog. "Stand back!" cried the captain sternly, and he led his captives through the curious throng until they came before a big range that stood in the center of the clearing. Beside this range was a butcher's block, upon which lay a great cleaver with a keen edge. It rested upon the flat of its back, its legs were crossed, and it was smoking a long pipe. "Wake up, your Majesty," said the captain. "Here are prisoners." Hearing this, King Kleaver sat up and looked at Dorothy sharply. "Gristle and Fat," he cried, "where did this girl come from?" "I found her in the forest and brought her here a prisoner," replied the captain. "Why did you do that?" inquired the king, puffing his pipe lazily. "To create some excitement," the captain answered. "It is so quiet here that we are all getting rusty for want of amusement. For my part, I prefer to see stirring times." "Naturally," returned the cleaver with a nod. "I have always said, Captain, without a bit of irony, that you are a sterling officer and a solid citizen, bold and polished to a degree. But what do you expect me to do with these prisoners?" "That is for you to decide," declared the captain. "You are the king." to be sure," muttered the cleaver, musingly. "As you say, we have had dull times since the steel and grindstone eloped and left us. Command my counselors and the royal courtiers to attend me, as well as the high priest and the judge. We'll then decide what can be done." The captain saluted and retired, and Dorothy sat down on an overturned kettle and asked, "Have you anything to eat in your kingdom?" "Here! Get up! Get off from me!" cried a faint voice, at which his Majesty the Cleaver said, "Excuse me, but you're sitting on my friend, the 10-quart kettle." Dorothy at once arose, and the kettle turned right side up and looked at her reproachfully. "I'm a friend of the king, so no one dares sit on me," said he. "I'd prefer a chair, anyway," she replied. "Sit on that hearth," commanded the king. So Dorothy sat on the hearth shelf of a big range, and the subjects of Utensia began to gather around in a large and inquisitive throng. Toto lay at Dorothy's feet, and Billina flew upon the range, which had no fire in it, and perched there as comfortably as she could. When all the counselors and courtiers had assembled, and these seemed to include most of the inhabitants of the kingdom, the king rapped on the block for order and said: "Friends and fellow utensils, our worthy commander of the Spoon Brigade, Captain Dip, has captured the 3 prisoners you see before you, and brought them here for I don't know what for. So I ask your advice how to act in this matter, and what fate I should mete out to these captives. Judge Sifter, stand on my right. It is your business to sift this affair to the bottom. High Priest Collender, stand on my left, and see that no one testifies falsely in this matter." As these 2 officials took their places, Dorothy asked, "Why is the Collender the High Priest?" "He's the holiest thing we have in the kingdom," replied King Kleaver. "Except me," said a sieve. "I'm the whole thing when it comes to holes." "What we need," remarked the king, rebukingly, "is a wireless sieve. I must speak to Marconi about it. These old-fashioned sieves talk too much. Now it is the duty of the king's counselors to counsel the king at all times of emergency, so I beg you to speak out and advise me what to do with these prisoners." "I demand that they be killed several times until they are dead," shouted a pepperbox, hopping around very excitedly. "Compose yourself, Mr. Paprika," advised the king. "Your remarks are piquant and highly seasoned, but you need a scattering of common sense. It is only necessary to kill a person once to make him dead, but I do not see that it is necessary to kill this little girl at all." "I don't either," said Dorothy. "Pardon me, but you are not expected to advise me in this matter," replied King Kleaver. "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "You might be prejudiced in your own favor, and so mislead us," he said. "Now then, good subjects, who speaks next?" "I'd like to smooth this thing over in some way," said a Flatiron, earnestly. "We are supposed to be useful to mankind, you know." "But the girl isn't mankind; she's womankind!" yelled a corkscrew. "What do you know about it?" inquired the king. "I'm a lawyer," said the corkscrew, proudly. "I'm accustomed to appear at the bar." "But you're crooked," retorted the king, "and that debars you. You may be a corking good lawyer, Mr. Pop, but I must ask you to withdraw your remarks." "Very well," said the corkscrew, sadly. "I see I haven't any pull at this court." "Permit me," continued the Flatiron, "to press my suit, your Majesty. I do not wish to gloss over any fault the prisoner may have committed, if such a fault exists, but we owe her some consideration, and that's flat." "I'd like to hear from Prince Carver," said the king. At this a stately carving knife stepped forward and bowed. "The captain was wrong to bring this girl here, and she was wrong to come," he said. "But now that the foolish deed is done, let us all prove our mettle and have a slashing good time." "That's it! That's it!" screamed a fat chopping knife. "We'll make mincemeat of the girl, and hash of the chicken, and sausage of the dog." There was a shout of approval at this, and the king had to rap again for order. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he said, "your remarks are somewhat cutting and rather disjointed, as might be expected from such acute intellects. But you give no reasons for your demands." "See here, Kleaver, you make me tired!" exclaimed a saucepan, strutting before the king very impudently. You're about the worst king that ever reigned in Utensia, and that's saying a good deal. Why don't you run things yourself instead of asking everybody's advice, like the big, clumsy idiot you are?" The king sighed. "I wish there wasn't a saucepan in my kingdom," he said. "You fellows are always stewing over something, and every once in a while you slop over and make a mess of it. Go hang yourself, sir, by the handle, and don't let me hear from you again." Dorothy was much shocked by the dreadful language the utensils employed, and she thought that they must have had very little proper training. So she said, addressing the king, who seemed very unfit to rule his turbulent subjects: "I wish you'd decide my fate right away. I can't stay here all day trying to find out what you're going to do with me." "This thing is becoming a regular broil, and it's time I took part in it," observed a big gridiron, coming forward. "What I'd like to know," said a can opener in a shrill voice, "is why the girl came to our forest, anyhow, and why she intruded upon Captain Dipp, who ought to be called Dippy, and who she is, and where she came from, and where she is going, and why, and wherefore, and therefore, and when." "I'm sorry to see, Sir Jabber," remarked the king to the can opener, "that you have such a prying disposition. As a matter of fact, all the things you mention are none of our business." Having said this, the king relighted his pipe, which had gone out. "Tell me, please, what is our business?" inquired a potato masher, winking at Dorothy somewhat impertinently. "I'm fond of little girls myself, and it seems to me she has as much right to wander in the forest as we have." "Who accuses the little girl, anyway?" inquired a rolling pin. "What has she done?" "I don't know," said the king. "What has she done, Captain Dipp?" "That's the problem, your Majesty. She hasn't done anything," replied the captain. "What do you want me to do?" asked Dorothy. This question seemed to puzzle them all. Finally a chafing dish exclaimed irritably: "If no one can throw any light on this subject, you must excuse me if I go out." At this a big kitchen fork pricked up its ears and said in a tiny voice: "Let's hear from Judge Sifter." "That's proper," returned the king. So Judge Sifter turned around slowly several times and then said: "We have nothing against the girl except the stove hearth upon which she sits. Therefore I order her instantly discharged." "Discharged!" cried Dorothy. "Why, I never was discharged in my life, and I don't intend to be. If it's all the same to you, I'll resign." "It's all the same," declared the king. "You are free, you and your companions, and may go wherever you like." "Thank you," said the little girl. "But haven't you anything to eat in your kingdom? I'm hungry." "Go into the woods and pick blackberries," advised the king, lying down upon his back again and preparing to go to sleep. "There isn't a morsel to eat in all Utensia that I know of." So Dorothy jumped up and said: "Come on, Toto and Billina. If we can't find the camp, we may find some blackberries." The utensils drew back and allowed them to pass without protest, although Captain Dipp marched the Spoon Brigade in close order after them until they had reached the edge of the clearing. There the spoons halted, but Dorothy and her companions entered the forest again and began searching diligently for a way back to the camp, that they might rejoin their party. End of chapter 16. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. How They Came to Bunbury. Wandering through the woods without knowing where you are going or what adventure you are about to meet next is not as pleasant as one might think. The woods are always beautiful and impressive, and if you are not worried or hungry, you may enjoy them immensely. But Dorothy was worried and hungry that morning, so she paid little attention to the beauties of the forest and hurried along as fast as she could go. She tried to keep in one direction and not circle around, but she was not at all sure that the direction she had chosen would lead her to the camp. By and by, to her great joy, she came upon a path. It ran to the right and to the left, being lost in the trees in both directions, and just before her, upon a big oak, were fastened two signs with arms pointing both ways. One sign read, "Take the other road to Bunbury," and the second sign read, "Take the other road to Bunnybury." "Well," exclaimed Billina, eyeing the signs, This looks as if we were getting back to civilization again." "I'm not sure about the civilization, dear," replied the little girl, "but it looks as if we might get somewhere, and that's a big relief, anyhow." "Which path shall we take?" inquired the Yellow Hen. Dorothy stared at the signs thoughtfully. "Bunbury sounds like something to eat," she said. "Let's go there." "It's all the same to me," replied Billina. She had picked up enough bugs and insects from the moss as she went along to satisfy her own hunger, but the hen knew Dorothy could not eat bugs, nor could Toto. The path to Bunbury seemed little traveled, but it was distinct enough and ran through the trees in a zigzag course until it finally led them to an open space filled with the queerest houses Dorothy had ever seen. They were all made of crackers, laid out in tiny squares, and were of many pretty and ornamental shapes, having balconies and porches with posts of breadsticks, and roofs shingled with wafer crackers. There were walks of bread crusts leading from house to house and forming streets, and the place seemed to have many inhabitants. When Dorothy, followed by Billina and Toto, entered the place, they found people walking the streets or assembled in groups talking together, or sitting upon the porches and balconies. And what funny people they were! Men, women, and children were all made of buns and bread. Some were thin and others fat. Some were white, some light brown, and some very dark of complexion. A few of the buns, which seemed to form the more important class of the people, were neatly frosted. Some had raisins for eyes and currant buttons on their clothes. Others had eyes of cloves and legs of stick cinnamon, and many wore hats and bonnets frosted pink and green. There was something of a commotion in Bunbury when the strangers suddenly appeared among them. Women caught up their children and hurried into their houses, shutting the cracker doors carefully behind them. Some men ran so hastily that they tumbled over one another, while others, more brave, assembled in a group and faced the intruders defiantly. Dorothy at once realized that she must act with caution in order not to frighten these shy people, who were evidently unused to the presence of strangers. There was a delightful, fragrant odor of fresh bread in the town, and this made the little girl more hungry than ever. She told Toto and Billina to stay back, while she slowly advanced toward the group that stood silently awaiting her. "You must 'scuse me for coming unexpected," she said softly, "but I really didn't know I was coming here until I arrived. I was lost in the woods, you know, and I'm as hungry as anything." "Hungry!" they murmured in a horrified chorus. "Yes, I haven't had anything to eat since last night's supper," she explained. "Are there any eatables in Bunbury?" They looked at one another undecidedly, and then one portly bun man, who seemed a person of consequence, stepped forward and said: "Little girl, to be frank with you, we are all eatables. Everything in Bunbury is eatable to ravenous human creatures like you. But it is to escape being eaten and destroyed that we have secluded ourselves in this out-of-the-way place, and there is neither right nor justice in your coming here to feed upon us." Dorothy looked at him longingly. "You're bread, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes, bread and butter. The butter is inside me so it won't melt and run. I do the running myself." At this joke all the others burst into a chorus of laughter, and Dorothy thought that they couldn't be much afraid if they could laugh like that. "Couldn't I eat something besides people?" she asked. "Couldn't I eat just one house, or a sidewalk, or something? I wouldn't mind much what it was, you know." "This is not a private bakery, child," replied the man sternly. "It's private property." "I know, Mr. "My name is C. Bunn, Esquire," said the man. "C stands for cinnamon, and this place is called after my family, which is the most aristocratic in the town." "Oh, I don't know about that," objected another of the queer people. "The Grahams and the Browns and Whites are all excellent families, and there are none better of their kind. I'm a Boston Brown myself." "I admit you are all desirable citizens," said Mr. Bunn, rather stiffly, "but the fact remains that our town is called Bunbury." "'Scuse me," interrupted Dorothy, "but I'm getting hungrier every minute. Now, if you're polite and kind, as I'm sure you ought to be, you'll let me eat something. There's so much to eat here that you never will miss it." Then a big, puffed-up man of a delicate brown color stepped forward and said: "I think it would be a shame to send this child away hungry, especially as she agrees to eat whatever we can spare, and not touch our people." "So do I, Pop," replied a Roll who stood near. "What, then, do you suggest, Mr. Over?" inquired Mr. Bunn. "Why, I'll let her eat my back fence if she wants to. It's made of waffles, and they're very crisp and nice." "She may also eat my wheelbarrow," added a pleasant-looking Muffin. "It's made of Nabiscos with a zuzu wheel." Very good," remarked Mr. Bunn. "That is certainly very kind of you. Go with Pop Over and Mr. Muffin, little girl, and they will feed you." "Thank you very much," said Dorothy gratefully. "May I bring my dog Toto and the Yellow Hen? They're hungry, too." "Will you make them behave?" asked the Muffin. "Of course," promised Dorothy. "Then come along," said Pop Over. So Dorothy and Billina and Toto walked up the street, and the people seemed no longer to be at all afraid of them. Mr. Muffin's house came first, and as his wheelbarrow stood in the front yard, the little girl ate that first. It didn't seem very fresh, but she was so hungry that she was not particular. Toto ate some, too, while Billina picked up the crumbs. While the strangers were engaged in eating, many of the people came and stood in the street, curiously watching them. Dorothy noticed 6 roguish-looking brown children standing all in a row, and she asked: "Who are you, little ones?" "We're the Graham Gems," replied one, "and we're all twins." "I wonder if your mother could spare 1 or 2 of you?" asked Billina, who decided that they were fresh baked. But at this dangerous question the 6 little gems ran away as fast as they could go. "You mustn't say such things, Billina," said Dorothy reprovingly. "Now let's go into Pop Over's back yard and get the waffles." "I sort of hate to let that fence go," remarked Mr. Over nervously as they walked toward his house. "The neighbors back of us are soda biscuits, and I don't care to mix with them." "But I'm hungry yet," declared the girl. "That wheelbarrow wasn't very big." "I've got a shortcake piano, but none of my family can play on it," he said reflectively. "Suppose you eat that." "All right," said Dorothy. "I don't mind. Anything to be accommodating." So Mr. Over led her into the house, where she ate the piano, which was of an excellent flavor. "Is there anything to drink here?" she asked. "Yes, I've a milk pump and a water pump. Which will you have?" he asked. "I guess I'll try 'em both," said Dorothy. So Mr. Over called to his wife, who brought into the yard a pail made of some kind of baked dough, and Dorothy pumped the pail full of cool, sweet milk and drank it eagerly. The wife of Pop Over was several shades darker than her husband. "Aren't you overdone?" the little girl asked her. "No, indeed," answered the woman. "I'm neither overdone nor done over. I'm just Mrs. Over, and I'm president of the Bunbury Breakfast Band." Dorothy thanked them for their hospitality and went away. At the gate Mr. Cinnamon Bun met her and said he would show her around the town. "We have some very interesting inhabitants," he remarked, walking stiffly beside her on his stick cinnamon legs, "and all of us who are in good health are well bred. If you are no longer hungry, we will call upon a few of the most important citizens." Toto and Billina followed behind them, behaving very well, and a little way down the street they came to a handsome residence where Aunt Sally Lunn lived. The old lady was glad to meet the little girl and gave her a slice of white bread and butter, which had been used as a doormat. It was almost fresh, and tasted better than anything Dorothy had eaten in the town. "Where do you get the butter?" she inquired. "We dig it out of the ground, which, as you may have observed, is all flour and meal," replied Mr. Bunn. "There is a butter mine just at the opposite side of the village. The trees which you see here are all doleanders and doteras, and in the season we get quite a crop of doughnuts off them." "I should think the flour would blow around and get into your eyes," said Dorothy. "No," said he. "We are bothered with cracker dust sometimes, but never flour." Then he took her to see Johnny Cake, a cheerful old gentleman who lived near by. "I suppose you've heard of me," said old Johnny with an air of pride. "I'm a great favorite all over the world." "Aren't you rather yellow?" asked Dorothy, looking at him critically. "Maybe, child, "But don't think I'm bilious, for I was never in better health in my life," replied the old gentleman. "If anything ailed me, I'd willingly acknowledge the corn." "Johnny's a trifle stale," said Mr. Bunn, as they went away, "but he's a good mixer and never gets cross-grained. I will now take you to call upon some of my own relatives." They visited the sugar buns, the currant buns, and the Spanish buns, the latter having a decidedly foreign appearance. Then they saw the French Rolls, who were very polite to them, and made a brief call upon the Parker H. Rolls, who seemed a bit proud and overbearing. "But they're not as stuck up as the Frosted Jumbles," declared Mr. Bunn, "who are people I really can't abide. I don't like to be suspicious or talk scandal, but sometimes I think the Jumbles have too much baking powder in them." Just then a dreadful scream was heard, and Dorothy turned hastily around to find a scene of great excitement a little way down the street. The people were crowding around Toto and throwing at him everything they could find at hand. They pelted the little dog with hardtack, crackers, and even articles of furniture which were hard baked and heavy enough for missiles. Toto howled a little as the assortment of baked stuff struck him, but he stood still with head bowed and tail between his legs until Dorothy ran up and inquired what the matter was. "Matter!" cried a rye loafer indignantly. "Why, the horrid beast has eaten 3 of our dear crumpets and is now devouring a salt-rising biscuit." "Oh, Toto, how could you?" exclaimed Dorothy, much distressed. Toto's mouth was full of his salt-rising victim, so he only whined and wagged his tail. But Billina, who had flown to the top of a cracker house to be in a safe place, called out: "Don't blame him, Dorothy. The crumpets dared him to do it." "Yes, and you pecked out the eyes of a Raisin Bun, one of our best citizens," shouted a bread pudding, shaking its fist at the Yellow Hen. "What's that? What's that?" wailed Mr. Cinnamon Bun, who had now joined them. "Oh, what a misfortune! What a terrible misfortune!" "See here," said Dorothy, determined to defend her pets, "I think we've treated you all pretty well, seeing you're eatables and regular food for us. I've been kind to you and eaten your old wheelbarrows and pianos and rubbish and not said a word. But Toto and Billina can't be 'spected to go hungry when the town's full of good things they like to eat, 'cause they can't understand your stingy ways as I do." "You must leave here at once," said Mr. Bunn sternly. "Suppose we won't go?" asked Dorothy, who was now much provoked. "Then," said he, "we will put you into the great ovens where we are made and bake you." Dorothy gazed around and saw threatening looks upon the faces of all. She had not noticed any ovens in the town, but they might be there nevertheless, for some of the inhabitants seemed very fresh. So she decided to go, and calling to Toto and Billina to follow her, she marched up the street with as much dignity as possible, considering that she was followed by the hoots and cries of the buns and biscuits and other baked stuff. End of chapter 17. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. How Ozma Looked into the Magic Picture. Princess Ozma was a very busy little ruler, for she looked carefully after the comfort and welfare of her people and tried to make them happy. If any quarrels arose, she decided them justly. If anyone needed counsel or advice, she was ready and willing to listen to them. For a day or two after Dorothy and her companions had started on their trip, Ozma was occupied with the affairs of her kingdom. Then she began to think of some manner of occupation for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em that would be light and easy and yet give the old people something to do. She soon decided to make Uncle Henry the keeper of the jewels, for someone really was needed to count and look after the bins and barrels of emeralds, diamonds, rubies, and other precious stones that were in the royal storehouses. That would keep Uncle Henry busy enough, but it was harder to find something for Aunt Em to do. The palace was full of servants, so there was no detail of housework that Aunt Em could look after. While Ozma sat in her pretty room, engaged in thought, she happened to glance at her magic picture. This was one of the most important treasures in all the land of Oz. It was a large picture set in a beautiful gold frame, and it hung in a prominent place upon a wall of Ozma's private room. Usually this picture seemed merely a country scene, But whenever Ozma looked at it and wished to know what any of her friends or acquaintances were doing, the magic of this wonderful picture was straightway disclosed. For the country scene would gradually fade away, and in its place would appear the likeness of the person or persons Ozma might wish to see, surrounded by the actual scenes in which they were then placed. In this way the Princess could view any part of the world she wished, and watch the actions of anyone in whom she was interested. Ozma had often seen Dorothy in her Kansas home by this means, and now, having a little leisure, she expressed a desire to see her little friend again. It was while the travelers were at Fuddlecumjig, and Ozma laughed merrily as she watched in the picture her friends trying to match the pieces of Grandmother Knit. "They seem happy and are doubtless having a good time," the Ruler said to herself, and then she began to think of the many adventures she herself had encountered with Dorothy. The images of her friends now faded from the magic picture, and the old landscape slowly reappeared. Ozma was thinking of the time when, with Dorothy and her army, she marched to the Nome King's underground cavern, beyond the land of Ev, and forced the old monarch to liberate his captives, who belonged to the royal family of Ev. That was the time when the Scarecrow nearly frightened the Nome King into fits by throwing one of Billina's eggs at him, and Dorothy had captured King Roquat's magic belt and brought it away with her to the Land of Oz. The pretty princess smiled at the recollection of this adventure, and then she wondered what had become of the Nome King since then. Merely because she was curious and had nothing better to do, Ozma glanced at the magic picture and wished to see in it the King of the Nomes. Roquat the Red went every day into his tunnel to see how the work was getting along, and to hurry his workmen as much as possible. He was there now, and Ozma saw him plainly in the magic picture. She saw the underground tunnel reaching far underneath the deadly desert which separated the Land of Oz from the mountains beneath which the Nome King had his extensive caverns. She saw that the tunnel was being made in the direction of the Emerald City, and knew at once it was being dug so that the army of Nomes could march through it and attack her own beautiful and peaceful country. "I suppose King Roquat is planning revenge against us," she said musingly, "and thinks he can surprise us and make us his captives and slaves. How sad it is that anyone can have such wicked thoughts! But I must not blame King Roquat too severely, for he is a Nome, and his nature is not so gentle as my own." Then she dismissed from her mind further thought of the tunnel, for that time, and began to wonder if Aunt Em would not be happy as royal mender of the stockings of the ruler of Oz. Ozma wore few holes in her stockings, still they sometimes needed mending. Aunt Em ought to be able to do that very nicely. Next day the Princess watched the tunnel again in her magic picture, and every day afterward she devoted a few minutes to inspecting the work. It was not especially interesting, but she felt that it was her duty. Slowly but surely the big arched hole crept through the rocks underneath the deadly desert, and day by day it drew nearer and nearer to the Emerald City. End of Chapter 18. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 19. How Bunnybury Welcomed the Strangers. Dorothy left Bunbury the same way she had entered it, and when they were in the forest again she said to Billina, "I never thought that things good to eat could be so disagreeable." "Often I've eaten things that tasted good, but were disagreeable afterward," returned the Yellow Hen. "I think, Dorothy, if eatables are going to act badly, it's better before than after you eat them." "Perhaps you're right," said the little girl with a sigh. "But what shall we do now?" "Let us follow the path back to the signpost," suggested Billina. "That will be better than getting lost again." "Why, we're lost anyhow," declared Dorothy. "But I guess you're right about going back to that signpost, Billina." They returned along the path to the place where they had first found it, and at once took the other road to Bunnybury. This road was a mere narrow strip, worn hard and smooth, but not wide enough for Dorothy's feet to tread. Still, it was a guide, and the walking through the forest was not at all difficult. Before long they reached a high wall of solid white marble, and the path came to an end at this wall. At first Dorothy thought there was no opening at all in the marble, but on looking closely she discovered a small square door about on a level with her head, and underneath this closed door was a bell push. Near the bell push a sign was painted in neat letters upon the marble, and the sign read, "No admittance except on business." This did not discourage Dorothy, however, and she rang the bell. Pretty soon a bolt was cautiously withdrawn, and the marble door swung slowly open. Then she saw it was not really a door, but a window, for several brass bars were placed across it, being set fast in the marble, and so close together that the little girl's fingers might barely go between them. Back of the bars appeared the face of a white rabbit, a very sober and sedate face, with an eyeglass held in its left eye and attached to a cord in his buttonhole. "Well, what is it?" asked the rabbit sharply. "I'm Dorothy," said the girl, "and I'm lost, and—" "State your business, please," interrupted the rabbit. "My business," she replied, "is to find out where I am, and to—" "No one is allowed in Bunnybury without an order or a letter of introduction from either Ozma of Oz or Glinda the Good," announced the rabbit. "So that settles the matter." And he started to close the window. "Wait a minute!" cried Dorothy. "I've got a letter from Ozma." "From the Ruler of Oz?" asked the rabbit doubtingly. "Of course. Ozma's my best friend, you know, and I'm a princess myself," she announced earnestly. "Ha! Let me see your letter," returned the rabbit, as if he still doubted her. So she hunted in her pocket and found the letter Ozma had given her. Then she handed it through the bars to the rabbit, who took it in his paws and opened it. He read it aloud in a pompous voice, as if to let Dorothy and Billina see that he was educated and could read writing. The letter was as follows: "It will please me to have my subjects greet Princess Dorothy, the bearer of this royal missive, with the same courtesy and consideration they would extend to me." "Ahem! It is signed Ozma of Oz," continued the rabbit, "and is sealed with the Great Seal of the Emerald City. Well, well, well! How strange! How remarkable!" "What are you going to do about it?" inquired Dorothy impatiently. "We must obey the royal mandate," replied the rabbit. "We are subjects of Ozma of Oz, and we live in her country. Also, we are under the protection of the great sorceress Glinda the Good, who made us promise to respect Ozma's commands." "Then may I come in?" she asked. "I'll open the door," said the rabbit. He shut the window and disappeared. But a moment afterward a big door in the wall opened and admitted Dorothy to a small room, which seemed to be a part of the wall and built into it. Here stood the rabbit she had been talking with, and now that she could see all of him, she gazed at the creature in surprise. He was a good-sized white rabbit with pink eyes, much like all other white rabbits. But the astonishing thing about him was the manner in which he was dressed. He wore a white satin jacket embroidered with gold and having diamond buttons. His vest was rose-colored satin with tourmaline buttons. His trousers were white to correspond with the jacket, and they were baggy at the knees, like those of a zouave, being tied with knots of rose ribbons. His shoes were of a white plush with diamond buckles, and his stockings were rose silk. The richness and even magnificence of the rabbit's clothing made Dorothy stare at the little creature wonderingly. Toto and Billina had followed her into the room, and when he saw them the rabbit ran to a table and sprang upon it nimbly. Then he looked at the three through his monocle and said, "These companions, Princess, cannot enter Bunnybury with you." "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "In the first place, they would frighten our people, who dislike dogs above all things on earth. And secondly, the letter of the royal Ozma does not mention them." "But they're my friends," persisted Dorothy, "and go wherever I go." "Not this time," said the rabbit decidedly. "You yourself, Princess, are a welcome visitor, since you come so highly recommended. But unless you consent to leave the dog and the hen in this room, I cannot permit you to enter the town." "Never mind us, Dorothy," said Billina. "Go inside and see what the place is like. You can tell us about it afterward, and Toto and I will rest comfortably here until you return." This seemed the best thing to do, for Dorothy was curious to see how the rabbit people lived, and she was aware of the fact that her friends might frighten the timid little creatures. She had not forgotten how Toto and Billina had misbehaved in Bunbury, and perhaps the rabbit was wise to insist on their staying outside the town. "Very well," she said. "I'll go in alone. I suppose you're the king of this town, aren't you?" "No," answered the rabbit. "I'm merely the keeper of the wicket, and a person of little importance, although I try to do my duty. I must now inform you, Princess, that before you enter our town you must consent to reduce." "Reduce what?" asked Dorothy. "Your size. You must become the size of the rabbits, although you may retain your own form." "Wouldn't my clothes be too big for me?" she inquired. "No, they will reduce when your body does." "Can you make me smaller?" asked the girl. "Easily," returned the rabbit. "And will you make me big again when I'm ready to go away?" "I will," said he. "All right, then; I'm willing," she announced. The rabbit jumped from the table and ran, or rather hopped, to the further wall, where he opened a door so tiny that even Toto could scarcely have crawled through it. "Follow me," he said. Now, almost any other girl would have declared that she could not get through so small a door, but Dorothy had already encountered so many fairy adventures that she believed nothing was impossible in the Land of Oz. So she quietly walked toward the door, and at every step she grew smaller and smaller, until, by the time the opening was reached, she could pass through it with ease. Indeed, as she stood beside the rabbit, who sat upon his hind legs and used his paws as hands, her head was just about as high as his own. Then the Keeper of the Wicket passed through, and she followed, after which the door swung shut and locked itself with a sharp click. Dorothy now found herself in a city so strange and beautiful that she gave a gasp of surprise. The high marble wall extended all around the place and shut out all the rest of the world. And here were marble houses of curious forms, most of them resembling overturned kettles, but with delicate, slender spires and minarets running far up into the sky. The streets were paved with white marble, and in front of each house was a lawn of rich green clover. Everything was as neat as wax, the green and white contrasting prettily together. But the rabbit people were, after all, the most amazing things Dorothy saw. The streets were full of them, and their costumes were so splendid that the rich dress of the Keeper of the Wicket was commonplace when compared with the others. Silks and satins of delicate hues seemed always used for material, and nearly every costume sparkled with exquisite gems. But the lady rabbits outshone the gentlemen rabbits in splendor, and the cut of their gowns was really wonderful. They wore bonnets, too, with feathers and jewels in them, and some wheeled baby carriages in which the girl could see wee bunnies. Some were lying asleep, while others lay sucking their paws and looking around them with big pink eyes. As Dorothy was no bigger in size than the grown-up rabbits, she had a chance to observe them closely before they noticed her presence. Then they did not seem at all alarmed, although the little girl naturally became the center of attraction, and all regarded her with great curiosity. "Make way!" cried the Keeper of the Wicket in a pompous voice. "Make way for Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz." Hearing this announcement, the throng of rabbits gave place to them on the walks, and as Dorothy passed along they all bowed their heads respectfully. Walking thus through several handsome streets, they came to a square in the center of the city. In this square were some pretty trees and a statue in bronze of Glinda the Good, while beyond it were the portals of the royal palace, an extensive and imposing building of white marble covered with a filigree of frosted gold. End of chapter 19. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 20. How Dorothy Lunched with a King. A line of rabbit soldiers was drawn up before the palace entrance, and they wore green and gold uniforms with high shakos upon their heads, and held tiny spears in their hands. The captain had a sword and a white plume in his shako. "Salute!" cried the Keeper of the Wicket. "Salute Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz." "Salute!" yelled the captain, and all the soldiers promptly saluted. They now entered the great hall of the palace, where they met a gaily dressed attendant, from whom the Keeper of the Wicket inquired if the king were at leisure. "I think so," was the reply. "I heard his Majesty blubbering and wailing as usual only a few minutes ago. If he doesn't stop acting like a crybaby, I'm going to resign my position here and go to work." "What's the matter with your king?" asked Dorothy, surprised to hear the rabbit attendant speak so disrespectfully of his monarch. "Oh, he doesn't want to be king, that's all, and he simply has to," was the reply. "Come," said the Keeper of the Wicket sternly, "lead us to his Majesty, and do not air our troubles before strangers, I beg of you." "Why, if this girl is going to see the king, he'll air his own troubles," returned the attendant. "That is his royal privilege," declared the Keeper. So the attendant led them into a room all draped with cloth of gold and furnished with satin-covered gold furniture. There was a throne in this room, set on a dais and having a big cushioned seat, and on this seat reclined the Rabbit King. He was lying on his back with his paws in the air and whining very like a puppy dog. Your Majesty, get up! Here's a visitor," called out the attendant. The king rolled over and looked at Dorothy with one watery pink eye. Then he sat up and wiped his eyes carefully with a silk handkerchief and put on his jeweled crown, which had fallen off. "Excuse my grief, fair stranger," he said in a sad voice. "You behold in me the most miserable monarch in all the world. What time is it, Blinkum?" "1 o'clock, your Majesty," replied the attendant to whom the question was addressed. "Serve luncheon at once," commanded the king. "Luncheon for two. That's for my visitor and me. And see that the human has some sort of food she's accustomed to." "Yes, your Majesty," answered the attendant, and went away. "Tie my shoe, Bristle," said the king to the Keeper of the Wicket. "Ah me! How unhappy I am!" "What seems to be worrying your Majesty?" asked Dorothy. "Why, it's this king business, of course," he returned, while the Keeper tied his shoe. "I didn't want to be king of Bunnybury at all, and the rabbits all knew it. So they elected me, to save themselves from such a dreadful fate, I suppose. And here I am, shut up in a palace where I might be free and happy." "Seems to me," said Dorothy, "it's a great thing to be a king." "Were you ever a king?" inquired the monarch. "No," she answered, laughing. "Then you know nothing about it," he said. "I haven't inquired who you are, but it doesn't matter. While we're at luncheon I'll tell you all my troubles. They're a great deal more interesting than anything you can say about yourself." "Perhaps they are to you," replied Dorothy. "Luncheon is served!" cried Blinkum, throwing open the door, and in came a dozen rabbits in livery, all bearing trays which they placed upon the table, where they arranged the dishes in an orderly manner. "Now clear out, all of you!" exclaimed the king. "Bristle, you may wait outside in case I want you." When they had gone and the king was alone with Dorothy, he came down from his throne, tossed his crown into a corner, and kicked his ermine robe under the table. "Sit down," he said, "and try to be happy. It's useless for me to try, because I'm always wretched and miserable. But I'm hungry, and I hope you are." "I am," said Dorothy. "I've only eaten a wheelbarrow and a piano today. Oh, yes, and a slice of bread and butter that used to be a doormat." "That sounds like a square meal," remarked the king, seating himself opposite her. "But perhaps it wasn't a square piano, eh?" Dorothy laughed. "You don't seem so unhappy now," she said. "But I am," protested the king, fresh tears gathering in his eyes. "Even my jokes are miserable. I'm wretched, woeful, afflicted, distressed, and dismal as an individual can be. Are you not sorry for me?" "No," answered Dorothy honestly, "I can't say I am. Seems to me that for a rabbit you're right in clover. This is the prettiest little city I ever saw." "Oh, the city is good enough," he admitted. "Glinda the Good Sorceress made it for us because she was fond of rabbits. I don't mind the city so much, although I wouldn't live here if I had my choice. It is being king that has absolutely ruined my happiness." "Why wouldn't you live here by choice?" she asked. "Because it is all unnatural, my dear. Rabbits are out of place in such luxury. When I was young I lived in a burrow in the forest. I was surrounded by enemies and often had to run for my life. It was hard getting enough to eat, at times, and when I found a bunch of clover I had to listen and look for danger while I ate it. Wolves prowled around the hole in which I lived, and sometimes I didn't dare stir out for days at a time. Oh, how happy and contented I was then! I was a real rabbit, as nature made me, wild and free, and I even enjoyed listening to the startled throbbing of my own heart." "I've often thought," said Dorothy, who was busily eating, "that it would be fun to be a rabbit." "It is fun when you're the genuine article," agreed his Majesty. "But look at me now. I live in a marble palace instead of a hole in the ground. I have all I want to eat, without the joy of hunting for it. Every day I must dress in fine clothes and wear that horrible crown till it makes my head ache. Rabbits come to me with all sorts of troubles, when my own troubles are the only ones I care about. When I walk out I can't hop and run. I must strut on my rear legs and wear an ermine robe. And the soldiers salute me, and the band plays, and the other rabbits laugh and clap their paws and cry out 'Hail to the King!' Now let me ask you, as a friend and a young lady of good judgment, isn't all this pomp and foolishness enough to make a decent rabbit miserable?" "Once," said Dorothy reflectively, "men were wild and unclothed, and lived in caves and hunted for food as wild beasts do. But they got civilized in time, and now they'd hate to go back to the old days." "That is an entirely different case," replied the King. "None of you humans were civilized in one lifetime. It came to you by degrees. But I have known the forest and the free life, and that is why I resent being civilized all at once, against my will, and being made a king with a crown and an ermine robe. Pah!" "If you don't like it, why don't you resign?" she asked. "Impossible!" wailed the rabbit, wiping his eyes again with his handkerchief. "There's a beastly law in this town that forbids it. When one is elected a king, there's no getting out of it." "Who made the laws?" inquired Dorothy. "The same sorceress who made the town, Glinda the Good. She built the wall and fixed up the city and gave us several valuable enchantments and made the laws. Then she invited all the pink-eyed white rabbits of the forest to come here, after which she left us to our fate." "What made you accept the invitation and come here?" asked the child. "I didn't know how dreadful city life was, and I'd no idea I would be elected king," said he, sobbing bitterly. And now I'm IT with a capital I, and can't escape." "I know Glinda," remarked Dorothy, eating for dessert a dish of Charlotte Russe, "and when I see her again I'll ask her to put another king in your place." "Will you? Will you, indeed?" asked the King joyfully. "I will if you want me to," she replied. "Hurroo! Hooray!" shouted the King, and then he jumped up from the table and danced wildly about the room, waving his napkin like a flag and laughing with glee. After a time he managed to control his delight and returned to the table. "When are you likely to see Glinda?" he inquired. "Oh, perhaps in a few days," said Dorothy. "And you won't forget to ask her?" "Of course not." "Princess," said the Rabbit King earnestly, "you have relieved me of a great unhappiness, and I am very grateful. Therefore I propose to entertain you, since you are my guest and I am the King, as a slight mark of my appreciation. Come with me to my reception hall." He then summoned Bristle and said to him: "Assemble all the nobility in the great reception hall, and also tell Blinkem that I want him immediately." The Keeper of the Wicket bowed and hurried away, and his Majesty turned to Dorothy and continued: "We'll have time for a walk in the gardens before the people get here." The gardens were back of the palace and were filled with beautiful flowers and fragrant shrubs, with many shade and fruit trees and marble-paved walks running in every direction. As they entered this place, Blinkem came running to the King, who gave him several orders in a low voice. Then his Majesty rejoined Dorothy and led her through the gardens, which she admired very much. "What lovely clothes your Majesty wears!" she said, glancing at the rich blue satin costume embroidered with pearls in which the King was dressed. "Yes," he returned with an air of pride. "This is one of my favorite suits, but I have a good many that are even more elaborate. We have excellent tailors in Bunnybury, and Glinda supplies all the material. By the way, you might ask the Sorceress when you see her to permit me to keep my wardrobe." "But if you go back to the forest you will not need clothes," she said. "No," he faltered, "that may be so. But I've dressed up so long that I'm used to it, and I don't imagine I'd care to run around naked again. So perhaps the good Glinda will let me keep the costumes." "I'll ask her," agreed Dorothy. Then they left the gardens and went into a fine big reception hall, where rich rugs were spread upon the tiled floors, and the furniture was exquisitely carved and studded with jewels. The King's chair was an especially pretty piece of furniture, being in the shape of a silver lily with one leaf bent over to form the seat. The silver was everywhere thickly encrusted with diamonds, and the seat was upholstered in white satin. "Oh, what a splendid chair!" cried Dorothy, clasping her hands admiringly. "Isn't it?" answered the King, proudly. "It's my favorite seat, and I think it especially becoming to my complexion. While I think of it, I wish you'd ask Glinda to let me keep this lily chair when I go away." "It wouldn't look very well in a hole in the ground, would it?" she suggested. "Maybe not, but I'm used to sitting in it, and I'd like to take it with me," he answered. "But here come the ladies and gentlemen of the court, so please sit beside me and be presented." End of chapter 20.